sure you know what this is. Kind of describe what it is and what it meant to you when you saw it, and how you got into this whole crazy blockchain Bitcoin space.
Sure, so this is the famous Bitcoin Genesis block. It's the data that was put into the very first block of the Bitcoin blockchain. And Bitcoin is, of course, the very first of the now very, very many blockchains, and the one that was basically the only one anyone cared about back in 2011 when I first joined the space. And at the time I was still only around like 17 years old, and but still I found Bitcoin fairly interesting. I found out about it on the internet and I thought, oh cool, it's this open source currency that people can make and then basically just trade between themselves, and the whole system runs without depending on any kind of corporations or governments, just as long as you have computers connected to each other, the thing can just keep going. And I found that that idea, and just generally this the open source culture, this whole concept of like a community of people independently just being able to do that, very interesting and empowering. And I first got into the space, I started by writing articles about Bitcoin for this site called Bitcoin Weekly. And that was fairly interesting because we basically tried to do this kind of donation model to pay for writers. So you would have a donation address, and at the start it basically got me nothing. But then we switched to this interesting model where we would publish the first paragraph of an article, and then we would say when the donation address reaches around $30, then we'll release the rest of the article. And this actually succeeded at paying me, like something like $5 or $10 an hour. So unfortunately, that ended up working for a bit, but then shut down, and then I went off to do Bitcoin Magazine from there, and then over time kind of got enough knowledge to figure out what I thought was the next logical step for the space to go, and that's basically where Ethereum came from. Yeah, and it's definitely been a long journey, and it's been really interesting just to see the sheer kind of progress that the crypto space has made in the last 7 years.
Yeah. So you mentioned, the whole open source movement. So Sean, you may know that he started this company in 2006 called OpenMocha, which is actually the first open source mobile operating system, even before Android. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Where is the open source movement right now? Where is it heading? And especially with all the data, centralized data silos, where are we at? How do we get to a point where there's more open sharing? Is open source software more important, or actually open data systems? Yeah,
I feel like the open source movement kind of over the last 20 years both won and lost at the same time. Like it won because it's in many industries just the default is to open source everything unless you can come up with a good reason to proprietarize it. It's internet browsers are open source. Like Android is largely open source. A lot of the applications that we just use in their day-to-day lives are open source or based on open standards of some kind. But then the problem with the open source vision is that it made a lot of sense in the 1990s, but it was kind of incomplete because in the 1990s, software was mostly about what happened on your own computer. And so the vision of you being in control of your own stuff, in order to realize that, you basically just needed to make sure the data was already on your computer, so the software had to be open so you could see what it was doing, and you could modify it if you wanted to, and so forth as well. But as we've moved from primarily kind of computer localized applications to web applications, the data basically moved into the cloud. And the cloud is this really kind of nice and evil metaphor because it makes it like a cloud, if you think about it, a literal cloud is a really decentralized thing. Nobody controls it. It's guaranteed to be there. Nobody can take out a switch and shut the whole thing down. It doesn't have, US, Chinese, Russian, whatever government backdoors. And the cloud as it exists in the digital world has none of those properties. It just literally is servers controlled by other people. And the software may well be open source, but then it talks to a backend, and if that backend is totally proprietary, and the backend is just storing your information, and if someone hacks into it, they can get all your data at any time, and like basically, like, even if everything the client sees and touches is open source, there's not much point, right? Like, sure, Firefox and Chrome are open source, but first of all, how many of the web pages really are? Like, even if they're JavaScript, the JavaScript is often obfuscated and minified to hell. And even if it wasn't, then you'd still be in touch with the server backend. So in that way, I do think that there has been this kind of fairly large step backward. Though, now in terms of how we can kind of move beyond that, right, there's, I think, two challenges. One of them, the technical one, of just how can you get the benefits of having information shared between all of the users, and between, you know, people who can do machine learning models on top of it and all of the good stuff that we want to get out of big data without the privacy losses that come from big data. And the second thing is the kind of economic challenge, which is one of the big things that's always been an issue with free open source software, which is if they can't make money by selling you software and preventing you from giving copies away for free, and if they can't make money by controlling your data and doing whatever they want with it, then how do you make data, right? Mm-hmm. How do you make money, right? Like, even for blockchain applications, there seems to there is this brief kind of opening where a few projects were able to get a lot of money with basically selling tokens, and this is why, you know, the Ethereum Foundation, for example, is able to be kind of fairly morally pure about open sourcing things, but at the same time, it's got a very substantial pool of capital that it uses to kind of fund projects and development and support the ecosystem. But that's not that model itself is still very imperfect, and even this year you can see signs of people just over applying it in a bunch of ways, right? Like, you basically have all these token projects where the token ends up not really having any good connection to the actual application. The token's not really needed for the application. The application becomes much worse because you have to go through all these 4 steps in order to buy and use a token for it. And sometimes the token just doesn't really have actual value, and they're basically grabbing money in an ICO, and then after that they don't really have much of an incentive to care. So, I mean, it's a good partial solution for a few things, but it's still only a very, very partial solution. So I think figuring out how to do that incentivization is definitely probably kind of the big challenge for the industry and the success of it as a whole. I mean, I can't kind of pretend to have really good solutions, because if I did, then I will have solved what's probably one of the one of the bigger, you know, social problems faced by humanity in the 21st century. So that's kind of hard, but there are kind of steps that we can do to try. So there's some things that we can do around, you know, using cryptography to get people's data, but then still, or get the benefit of people's data without actually getting, or while keeping the data itself private. You can make data marketplaces where people can get paid for the data that they share. You can use some various kinds of token and fee models to make, you know, things like online social media work better potentially. There's you know, even for blockchain applications, there's various different kind of fee models that people are coming up with. So I think that with a lot of very open experimentation, there are definitely things that we can try to figure out, but it definitely is a very significant challenge.
Do you think that the token is sort of the answer to this business model question, or is it just one part of it? I mean,
the token is an answer in some cases, part of an answer in other cases, and definitely not any part of the answer in many other cases.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then, do you see a world where these tokens get abstracted to where people don't have to deal with them for the cognitive overhead of them, or do you think this is something that we're gonna kind of keep tokens Like messaging apps, I don't know. I mean,
Sure.
Yeah.
And first of all, I think even tokens in general are a fairly kind of limited mental frame.
Yeah.
So I'll give one example, right? There's a site called Peepeth that recently appeared. It's basically a blockchain-based semi-decentralized Twitter, and they do a couple of really interesting things. One of them is that it's like blockchain-based and decentralized. Another interesting kind of social thing that they're trying to do is they're making their front end more kind of quote opinionated. So they're deliberately designing the application in order to kind of discourage some of the nasty feedback loops that we see in Twitter itself. But one of the really cool features that they have is they have this badges, where a badge is something that basically it's something that can appear on your profile beside your account. And you can get badges for things like donating to charity. So for example, the first one that they launched, if you basically donate at least $25 to the Against Malaria Foundation, then you get this kind of nice purple mosquito badge on your account and everyone sees that you did that. And so it's a kind of gamifying donations in that way, which I think is really interesting. So you can sell way more things than coins, right? You can sell coins, you can sell badges, you can sell virtual real estate, you can pre-sell virtual ad space, you can do pre-sell short usernames, premium domain names, a whole bunch of things. From an economic point of view, right, the goal is basically there's all these theories that are from Thorstein Veblen and so forth, that a lot of the really expensive things people buy, a huge part of the value isn't the actual product, it's basically some kind of status signaling, and it's about basically either expressing that you're rich enough to buy the thing, or it's expressing who you are as a person and so forth. And so if you can make a combine economic innovation with this cultural movement and try to basically get to the point where buying a $20,000 anti-malaria charity badge is the thing that you do to, I don't know, propose to your wife, then society, or even something that you would just do to show that you're a really cool elite user of some application or whatever, then that's an interesting path toward kind of solving a bunch of incentivization problems.
Can we go back to the data
Sure.
question for a second? In the early days, I know you were quite excited about DAOs. What's your current thoughts on those, and do you see how do those play with this sort of future business model data type stuff?
I think one of the problems with DAOs is that they have to have this kind of long-term governance, and in general, writing out the rules of a governance for an organization in such a way that the organization is not exploitable in some way is really hard. Even with corporations, right? You have rules that are kind of hard in that it's written in legalese, which is supposed to be formal logic, but there's still a kind of layer of softness because you have courts interpreting it. But even still, you have hostile takeovers, activist investors, various kinds of corporate attacks, all of this spooky stuff you can read about on novels written by people complaining about Wall Street. And with DAOs, you have very similar problems to that, but at the same time you have both new challenges because the code is in some sense even harder, but you also have new tools because the so for example, one of the really interesting tools that you get is this concept of splitting, right? Where if the majority of a DAO does something that the minority disagrees, then the minority can basically kind of fork the entire application and kind of split off part of it. And people who thought that the minority did the right thing can basically just switch over to that minority DAO and then start using it. And if the minority was in the right, then the argument goes that, well, the minority application is the application where the people who hold the tokens are the people that actually believe that, and so that's the application that you would want to participate in. And so that's the application that the market would say is more valuable, and the other one is the one the market says is less valuable, and so the attack fails. And the threat of that happening is what incentivizes people to normally act nicely in the first place, so the thing almost never has to split. So
That is quite similar to like the governance of open source projects, right?
Absolutely,
so we've had some decades of work at that.
Blockchain-based constructs are really interesting because they're kind of like open source software, but not quite like open source software. They're kind of like corporations, not quite like corporations. They're kind of like countries, but not quite like countries. Yeah.
But like, let's say you wanted to do more work in these DAOs. Do you call it DAO or you call it DAO?
Probably DAO.
DAO, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Are there simple experiments that you see that people could do that would kind of...
One idea that I had...
The equivalent of like the 100-line of code smart contract.
Right. Yeah, so one idea that I had is this DAICO, right, which is a kind of combination of an ICO and a DAO, where basically instead of the money going to the developers immediately, where if they want, they could just like basically disappear and spend it all on a vacation in the Caribbean, you would... put the money into a smart contract, and then after that you basically have the voters, and the voters have the ability to basically vote on the amount of money per second that the company receives. And they can basically, it starts off being some small amount, so it could be, I don't know, $1,000 a day or whatever, but then as the company proves itself, then the voters can basically vote to turn the tab up over time. And if the voters decide that the DAO is just not working at all, or sorry, that the developers are not working at all, or that it's a scam or whatever, then the voters can vote and basically like take all the remaining money back and redistribute it back among themselves. So the reason why this model is nice is because it kind of combines the voting trust model with the trust model of like trusting in this company, and it makes it so that unless both of those fail at the exact same time, the people are guaranteed to get to not lose all of their money. So I think models like that are definitely very interesting.
So a primitive that we would need to do well is this voting stuff, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you can try different voting schemes. Like, you could also make the voting you could use things like quadratic voting, you could use delegated voting, you could do delegated quadratic voting, all sorts of fancy stuff. And yeah, from there you can experiment with a lot of governance models.
Do you think one day like the Ethereum Foundation will become a DAO? I mean, I know you're not them, but like...
No.
Is that something you guys talk about?
Yeah, we definitely talked about it. We definitely, I mean, Ethereum Foundation becoming a DAO, Ethereum Foundation funding DAOs, you know, all of this is really possible.
Because we're sort of in this kind of strange intermediate state where the people that are creating these next generation networks are using non-profits, essentially, super ancient sort of corporate tools to create these new things. Are these like training wheels that will come off soon, or are this like...
I definitely hope so.
Yeah.
Like it definitely, well, so one interesting question is, like, I do think it has to be a training wheel, and I do think that Ethereum can't, you know, survive and basically become a new class of international institution with like 30 people in a Swiss foundation controlling it.
Yeah.
But the question is the training wheel going something that has to come off for each individual project, or is the training wheel something that has to come off for the space as a whole, right? So like if it's for the space as a whole, then the argument is that eventually we'll discover some alternative form that basically creates these new projects as decentralized things right from the start. But then the other approach would be to say, oh, for a startup, like the point of startups is to have lots of them experiment with lots of different things, and most of them are supposed to fail, and then the ones that succeed grow bigger. And so at the startup phase, you want the like you might want it to be centralized and kind of dictatorial, and like basically give your entrepreneur the ability to kind of fully realize their artistic vision. And you know, for the same reason why books are written by a person and not by a committee. But then if something turns into a big institution, then you would want it to sort of decentralize over time, right?
So like, you know, going DAO would be the new IPO.
Kind of, yeah. Now the question is, of course, will founders be willing to do that, or will founders, you know, like basically kind of get taken in by the dark side and realize that, oh, maybe my intention initially was to grow the thing and then DAOify it, but now I have the chance to be the next Mark Zuckerberg, and so I'm going to grab the power. Mine, I got the ring. Oh, sorry, wrong finger. You can tell I don't like
the middle finger's good too.
Yeah, you can tell I don't like rings from this conversation. The thing that no, but the other. So then, if that's true, the question is, can you somehow create a structure that basically locks in the transition from centralization to decentralization from day one?
Yeah. Yeah, with maybe some kill switch or something like that.
Yeah.
And then do you feel that, like, it kind of go back to his question about the open source, the transition. So what are you seeing now with this stuff? I mean, like, to make a proprietary closed source blockchain is sort of an oxymoron. So we have kind of at least a base level now. But, like, how do you see this stuff evolve? Like, what's coming?
What's coming? I think first of all, the space is ultimately spinning its wheels in theory land until the applications start coming. And the applications are being developed, and I think the applications being developed and like real live applications starting to run is going to be an important kind of jolt of pragmatism for the space, because instead of kind of thinking in theory land about what things us developers and researchers up in the sky think are important, we'd actually have examples of what things are important to users, and like how public blockchain-based layers can improve in order to be more useful to their users. So I think that's going to be an important and healthy shift, and also just because, like, ultimately, if the space doesn't serve any users except the speculators, then what point does it have in the first place? So then the question is, like, what kinds of applications are coming, and then I do think there are a lot of interesting categories. Like, I think all of like tokenizing different kinds of things, including fiat currencies, including stickers, including potentially like various kinds of securities with if the regulatory frameworks like properly settle down for that. I think that'll be really interesting. All of this kind of self-sovereign identity stuff I think can be super valuable. I guess we'll see how those go, and then from there, there's going to be continued experimentation with DAOs. There's going to be continued experimentation with like applications for specific industries. Like you could even imagine like a plasma chain for hotel booking or things like that. So from there, like, we'll see which ones start happening. We'll see which ones succeed, and then the industry will go forward from there.
I mean, you seem to be very philosophical. I mean, did you grow up reading? What are the books you read? Who are the authors you follow now? Like,
I definitely read some of everything. I guess like when I was in Bitcoin earlier on, and I obviously followed like math and computer science and so forth closely. I started off in the kind of libertarian Austrian economics space, and then from there I
like
kind
Hayek
of Hayek, exactly, and then like brought into my kind of horizons more over those years. Like I understood in mainstream economics and social and kind of social science more. I follow like Les Wrong and like Sweetster Codex and rationalist blogs quite a bit. I try keep in touch with, or I kind of keep up with like behavioral economics, various kinds of social science outside of economics. One of the more interesting recent books that I read was Robin Hanson's The Elephant in the Brain, which basically talked about how we deceive ourselves about what our own motives are, and how basically the reason why I found it interesting is that I feel like one of the harder things to reconcile about kind of our models of human nature is that on the one hand, when you go around talking to people, plenty of people seem really, really nice, and almost everyone really seems like a nice person you can have tea with on some level. But then at the same time, World War II killed 65 million people. Right. So how do you kind of combine the macro and the micro? And the story there is that, and The Elephant in the Brain is basically that we have this combination of genuinely altruistic motives, genuinely selfish motives, a lot of random junk in the mix, and we ourselves aren't fully aware of what our motives are, and we even benefit from not being fully aware of what our motives are, because we get to kind of feel the warm glow of being charitable and not even realize that we're doing things that are actually self-serving, and then get the benefit of doing the things that are self-serving. And there's a bunch of really interesting examples. So one of them is, like, the first chapter is basically about how conversations are really not about sharing information so much as they are about showing off how educated and smart you are. Yeah. Cough, cough, case in point, but no. There's like other examples about in religion and kind of even politics and like tribal behavior and so forth. I also ended up just kind of learning a lot of this stuff hands-on from personal experience, because if you follow the crypto space, if you follow like the Bitcoin block size wars, Bitcoin Cash, Ethereum Classic, Craig Wright.
Nature at work.
Yeah, exactly. And you basically see the exact same mechanisms happening in like traditional politics and in crypto, and then you realize, yep, that's human nature. It's going to be pretty hard to erase that one.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's a very sort of deep human nature, or sort of religious. I'd like to recommend a book that I recently recommended to him that he's loving is Anti-Fragile.
Oh yes, I read that. That was great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Skin in the Game was really good too.
Sure. Skin in the Game, Black Swan. Yeah. He's one of my favorite thinkers. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the table.